Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic, and joining me, as usual, is Angelo Giuliano. Today, we're going to be talking all about U.S. encirclement of China. We have this proxy war going on in Ukraine between the U.S. and Russia, and as that is taking place, we have this conflict in the Middle East. And as I've constantly warned people, the U.S. ultimately has its sights set on China. This is the biggest problem for the ruling class of the United States seeking world hegemony. They want to stop the rise of China. So that is what we're going to be focusing on today. Thank you, everyone who is joining us live. Please check the video description for all the places you can find and follow Angelo's work as well as mine. And without further ado, Angelo, how are you? And what are your beginning thoughts on all of this? Is the U.S. ultimately focused on China, or is this, or have everything been patched up after President Xi Jinping visited San Francisco recently?
Well, I think the problem is that it seems like the U.S. is overextending. There are different fronts. We have already two fronts. We have a front in Ukraine, and we see actually that there's upcoming defeat there. We see lots of media that are actually shifting their narratives. They're saying clearly, well, it's just a matter of time for Ukraine to lose. And then there's a possible second front in the Middle East. And we see the U.S. is being attacked in different places in Iraq and in Syria. I think we overlook a little bit this. What they're worried is to be completely kicked out of the Middle East. So if you have an air carrier there in the Middle East, it's not only for Israel. I doubt that the U.S. would intervene in Israel, but they're very worried to be completely kicked out of the Middle East. And then they're still active in China. So we see actions, especially I think the most worrying is the Philippines, this radical shift from Duterte. Duterte he had a balanced approach with China. He was actually rather pro-China. And we had this surprise because Marcos was the protege of Duterte. And we all thought that the opposition was more dangerous. The opposition was basically controlled by NED, very pro-US, and we end up with Marcos, who's very anti-Chinese. He's actually inviting the US to build up US army bases. And we can see on the map, those US army bases are extremely close to Taiwan. And I'm afraid that Philippines is looking more and more like another Ukraine. What's your thoughts, Brian? Oh, you are cut. Just your microphone.
I always promised I would never do that. Okay, thank you, Angelo. So we have the map up. China, obviously, here in the middle, and we can see the United States. These dots are U.S. military presences around the region, not necessarily bases. But what we do know is the U.S. has multiple bases in South Korea and Japan, where tens of thousands of troops. You can see the numbers here. This is a little bit old because they also show U.S. troops in Afghanistan, but this gets the main point across. The United States is building a military presence all around China, from Central Asia all the way to East Asia and everywhere in between. They have not so much a big military presence in most of Southeast Asia. Most of these countries, again, as we pointed out many times, you and I, Angelo, most of Southeast Asia counts China as their largest trade partner, infrastructure partner, source of tourism, source of investment, and increasingly source of even arms sales. So Thailand, a lot of people believe Thailand, where I am based, is very pro-American. But in reality, they have been replacing almost all of their old American hardware with new Chinese weapon systems, everything from main battle tanks up to submarines and surface vessels. But the U.S. is getting this foothold in the Philippines, as you mentioned, Angela. We'll be getting into that in just a little bit. We also notice in Myanmar, I've covered Myanmar, and you and I, Angela, we've talked about this in previous live streams. The U.S., and I put on the screen earlier in this stream someone who pointed out that the U.S. is behind this arms uprising in Myanmar. They're behind all of these ethnic groups and also political opposition groups that are now armed and fighting the central government. And they fight amongst themselves over ethnic issues and political issues, but they all also are compelled to fight the central government. This is what the U.S. supports them in doing. This has been going on for decades. The fighting has escalated in the last couple of years after a military coup ousted Aung San Suu Kyi, who has been built up, again, for decades by the United States. So let's actually, before we get into that, I want to refresh everyone's memory. So we're looking at this map, and we see, we know the U.S. is trying to use India as a counterweight against China, and also now Russia, and it's not really working out at all. Also in Pakistan, we've talked about how U.S.-backed insurgents are attacking Chinese infrastructure projects, killing Chinese workers, killing Pakistani security forces. So that's South Asia. And we see in Southeast Asia, the U.S. meddling and attempting to create a united front there. And of course, we have East Asia, South Korea, Japan, and Philippines as part of Southeast Asia. So let's look at this. I want to bring this up and point this out. This is from all the way back in 1965. We've talked about this many times, and I want to cover some parts that I haven't actually read before. It says, but let's start with the main points. They're talking about bombing North Vietnam and deploying U.S. troops to Vietnam, and they said this is only going to make sense if it is in support of a long-run United States policy to contain communist China. And then it says, China looms as a major power threatening to undercut our importance and effectiveness in the world, and more remotely but more menacingly, to organize all of Asia against us. And so what is their counter to that? Is to organize all of Asia against China. That is what they have been doing from actually before 1965 all the way up to and including right now, regardless of who is in the White House, regardless of who is in Congress. And then it says they're talking about this long-run U.S. policy. It's based on an instinctive understanding in our country, the United States, that the peoples and resources of Asia could be effectively mobilized against us by China or by a Chinese coalition, and that the potential weight of such a coalition could throw us on the defensive and threaten our security. But they don't mean homeland security. They mean all of their meddling thousands of miles from their own shores. And it even kind of points that out. It says, we would move toward economic well-being, toward open societies. By that, they mean open up other countries so they can plunder them, toward cooperation between nations. The role we have inherited and have chosen for ourselves for the future is to extend our influence and power to thwart ideologies that are hostile to these aims and to move the world as best as we can in a direction we prefer. So they prefer to move the world in a direction that they want, regardless of what anyone else wants. And if you have an ideology or a sense of sovereignty and you want to determine your own destiny, they're going to fight. They're going to fight back against you, and they're going to undermine you. And then the important part, there are three fronts to a long-run effort to contain China, realizing that the Soviet Union contains China to the north, which it no longer does. Japan-Korea front, the Indian, Pakistan front, and the Southeast Asian front. And this map from recent years reflects this policy articulated all the way back in the 1960s. So before we get into Myanmar, which is part of the Southeast Asian front, do you have anything you want to add to that, Angelo, about the fact that no matter who you vote into office, this agenda continues to advance forward, and how each administration and how different people in Congress are constantly making up excuses as to why the U.S. needs to confront China, when in reality, they have been very clear. They don't accept China as a strong sovereign nation that will eventually surpass them.
Yeah, I think it's important just to go back at how imperialism has been working in the transition. We use people have the concept of imperialism as the old concept was you have army, they go, you have boots on the ground, and you start controlling the country. And then there's been transitions, and I think one of the main transitions, like milestone and transition was with when they changed from a CIA covert operation to NED, National Endowment for Democracy. So basically what you do is you are going much softer. You hijack the civil society, and slowly you penetrate democracy and you hijack the democracy. And I think this process is becoming more and more subtle. It goes into like the sovereignty, which is information space. What they do right now is most of those politicians are pre-selected by the collective West. So they groom them. They find them out, let's say they find them out at the university. For example, Macron was identified very early on. He was in Rothschild Bank. He went through the French American Foundation. He's a and so they get him through that, and then so they groom them and they give them a very good future, very good prospect, and that they do the revolving door. They're going from there to those Ivy League schools to being politicians, go back and forth, but they pledge allegiance to this new world order, which is ultimately controlled by the US and the globalist elites. So we need to be extremely careful. People don't see that. But the job we do, you and I, is to look at sovereignty, and the sovereignty comes in many different forms. And one which is extremely important is information space. So that's how they do. And this is why whenever we look at those candidates, let's say Marcos in the Philippines, or let's say in Europe. Europe is much more obvious because it's clear, Let's say Argentina, Javier Milei. Javier Milei, just look at his background. He's a World Economic Forum. He's all in. He's a globalist. It's part of the globalist agenda. But guess what? He's positioning himself as, MAGA. Make Argentina great again. Actually, it's a coincidence, but it's a. So that's a focus on your own country, but in reality, you're not working for Argentina. The first thing he did was to, he had his kippah and he goes to New York and he pledged allegiance to Israel. So this is why we need to actually pay that attention to all those politicians that are pre-selected, and that's how they do. And when we touch, you and I, we touched Myanmar. Myanmar is so obvious. It was so easy. Aung San Suu Kyi, she was British. She was completely British education. She was working for the West, and she was surrounded by foreign advisors.
White guys, literally just white guys from the UK, from Australia, literally in her inner circle running her policies. Yes, Angela.
Exactly. Continue. The same as the co-runner right now, the DPP, is they have half American, half Taiwanese. She was born, let me think, she was born in Taiwan, then she lived in Japan, and then in the US. Or was she born in Japan? And so she had to renounce of American citizenship, and she went through, she was already active with the National Endowment for Democracy, which, by the way, just to remind people, that's the CIA in 2004. So we need to look at always the background. Where does this person come from? Was he pre-selected, and so on? And that's what we look at. We look at those pre-selection, media, financing, NGOs, and the level of penetration of those NGOs, which I mean, it's called non-government organization. I mean, they are government. They are funded by government. It's funny that they call them a non-government organization. So that's what we need to pay attention. And we see all around China. We can analyze one country at a time. Philippines, Thailand, Myanmar. There's been huge meddling. There's only a few countries that managed to do well and to protect their sovereignty. One of them is Cambodia. Do you have any other examples? We have actually. Did you see Victoria Nuland? She went to Nepal. I mean, remember, every single time that Victoria Nuland goes to a country, you can be sure something might happen, and it comes into the forms of a color revolution, and we see what happened. The color revolution, what happened for Ukraine? What did it bring to Ukraine? Self-destruction, right?
Yes. And actually, Angela, that's a very important point that everyone needs to keep in mind. The fact that the U.S. is committed to encircling and containing China for decades, and what happens when the U.S. uses a country as a battering ram against one of its chief adversaries. So when we talk about Myanmar or the Philippines or Taiwan, they are going to burn them to the ground just like they did Ukraine. There is no example of a successful U.S. client state that is thriving and advancing. There is no such thing. That is a myth. By now, that should be obvious to everyone. So I want to start actually with what's going on in Myanmar. I've had many people in the comment section ask, what's going on. I hear about the rebels taking over and the army is on the defensive. We can't actually get a very clear picture of what exactly is going on. I have reliable contacts that send me information. They say that, yes, these rebels are fighting heavily in the north, along the border between Myanmar and China, and they are trying to cut off the trade routes between Myanmar and China. And I just want to show people how important China is to Myanmar. So here is Harvard University's Atlas of Economic Complexity. This is where Myanmar exports to. So China, obviously huge. And then the rest of Asia, second, and then everyone else is almost negligible. And then in terms of imports, again, China, massive. Thailand, its next door neighbor, very important import sources of imports. And so over the years, and this was 2022, this was last year, China is including Myanmar in its Belt and Road Initiative. There's pipelines, there's dams, there's ports being built by China in Myanmar. This benefits Myanmar, obviously. It also clearly benefits China. And what are these U.S.-backed militants doing? They're literally attacking the joint infrastructure projects that Myanmar's central government has built with China. And so this was China-backed pipeline facility damaged in Myanmar resistance attack. We also remember when the escalation first began, they went around burning Chinese factories as well. So they're complaining about the government and they want democracy, but then all they do is attack Chinese factories, Chinese infrastructure projects, which don't represent their own best interests. It represents what Washington would love to do. If they could just do anything without consequence, they would bomb Chinese infrastructure everywhere, just physically blow up the Belt and Road Initiative, but they can't, so they use proxies to do it. So that's what they were doing. This is a little more recent. One of my contacts actually sent me this, and they were talking about how the coup in 2021 that ousted Aung San Suu Kyi and her literal white guys, inner circle of white guys, they began establishing these trade routes and rail projects with China, to and from China, to the port here in Rakhine State. That was where the U.S. was stirring up trouble between the Rohingya and these ultra racist followers of Aung San Suu Kyi. They constantly blamed it on the army, which is not blameless, but it was primarily Aung San Suu Kyi's followers that were brutalizing the Rohingya. And they were doing that specifically because that is exactly where China was trying to build the port. They were trying to destabilize that region and prevent that construction. That is what the U.S. is doing. And that is what most of the, yes, someone just said, just like Nord Stream 2, where the U.S. did actually just literally blow it up. That's where they are right. That's the place the United States is right now. And they have all of these smoke screens about why they're fighting, why they have to confront Russia and China, but it really is because they don't want to lose control of the planet. They will literally blow up these projects to keep everyone artificially dependent on them. Okay, so these trade routes, and so what are these rebels doing? They're trying to cut the trade routes. So this was from Global Times. This is Chinese media. And this was just from November 25th. PLA conducts real combat drill along China-Myanmar border, a necessary act to deal with emergencies, potential escalation. Experts, and they're talking about the militants conducting attacks all along the border and cutting these routes, and how serious this is, and it threatens to drag China into it, just like the U.S. destabilized Ukraine and dragged Russia into Ukraine. Now they're trying to do something very similar in Myanmar. So Angela, do you have anything else you want to add about Myanmar? Because I'm going to do Myanmar
Yeah,
and then the Philippines and then Taiwan.
maybe if you can go back to the map, I think would be interesting for the viewers just to look at what do they want to do, and especially there's a pipeline. There's a
Yes,
pipeline.
that's a very good point. Yes.
That pipeline, I think it's the formers when you saw the routes, and actually this is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. If you can get just a little bit closer, we can see actually what they were trying to do is just to cut this pipeline, which is extremely important for China because it bypasses the Malacca Strait. So you see, China has to go all around to the Malacca Strait, and the Malacca Strait is very problematic for China because if China was to go into confrontation with the US, probably the US would use this Malacca Strait to do a blockade, probably similar to what they did to Japan during World War II. So you have those projects, and you have this very, very critical pipeline for China. And what they've been trying to do is just to destroy or actually to contain projects, infrastructure projects. And I think you see, for example, there was this dam, a huge dam that they wanted to build. And Aung San Suu Kyi, what she was working on, and she had actually one advisor that was working close to her. And his single job was to work on just containing the project on the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is why actually what the military did, because people don't understand. When people hear there's a military coup, they say, well, military must be bad because they're going against democracy. No, it's not. Actually, you see, you have the power of the military is actually to protect the constitution, protect sovereignty. When the so-called democracy is actually is being hijacked, that is a responsibility of the military to take over. And that's what they did. It's constitutional coup, and it's only normal because ultimately, we say it over and over, you cannot have a democracy if you don't have sovereignty. So sovereignty was just a joke. It had become a joke in Myanmar. There's actually, I want to go back because that's extremely important. When Aung San Suu Kyi, she was just elected, what they did, they sat down all the U.S. State Department. There was George Soros. They were probably BlackRock, all those banksters, because that's what they are. They are bankers, gangsters. They were actually talking about how are we going to plunder Myanmar. That's what they did. The first thing they did. So so you see, and that's the payback time. So I think I have the impression that what the military did was to close an eye on this. They were closing an eye. They let them do it, and then they knocked them out completely. They shut down everything: U.S. aid, USAID, all those millions of dollars that were poured into a country which is extremely poor. Imagine USAID was putting $50 million just like this into Myanmar. When you have $50 million, you can hijack. How many people can you buy with $50 million? You are the king. Yeah. You control. Money is power, and that's how they do in the region. So it's only normal. People need to understand that coup doesn't mean that it's anti-democratic. On the contrary, when it comes to Myanmar, it is not. It's actually in order to protect your sovereignty and ultimately your democracy.
Absolutely. And the last two coups in Thailand were the exact same case. A U.S. client regime selling the country out from under the Thai people, the military, very incrementally, because they didn't want to do what Myanmar did and end up a pariah. So they did it very incrementally over many years. They conducted two coups, which was risky, but they didn't want to move too quickly and stir things up too much. But it was for the exact same reason, Angelo. It was because the U.S. got their client regime into power and they were going to wreck the country, just like they've done to Ukraine. And they were visibly hurting the country. I mean, I was here for both coups, and I could see the damage that was being done. I could still see damage being done by these U.S.-backed opposition parties and also organizations, and Myanmar is suffering from the exact same affliction. And as Angela was pointing out, this is the Malacca Strait. This is where everything has to go through that's being shipped to and from China. And so having road, rail, and pipelines here allows them to skip this part of the trip and just send it overland to Yunnan province, Kunming, and beyond. And so this is a huge step forward for China. Myanmar obviously benefits. They are in desperate need of modern infrastructure, and this building drive gives them that infrastructure. And what is the U.S. doing? Are they competing by offering Myanmar a better deal to build road, rail, pipelines, airports, seaports? No. Their response to it is to burn everything down. That is what they're doing to Myanmar. And I have people who support the military in Myanmar. They're from Myanmar. They do not say that the military is perfect. They admit that it's corrupt, in some cases incompetent, but it's not as bad as the U.S.-backed client regime. Obviously. So you don't have to do absolutes here, where you say, well, if I support the military, it means I support everything else that they're doing. It's not true. It's not true. It's just like when Syria is fixing its relationship with Turkey, it doesn't mean it approves of everything Turkey is still doing to Syria right now. So we got to keep all of that in mind. So I was touching on this Global Times article. Angela, I think you brought up a really good point. Now let's move to the Philippines. Okay, let's look at the map again. So Myanmar here. Yes.
Can I add one thing? Just what you said.
Sure.
It's really important for people to understand. We are not saying, okay, well, the military are good or bad in Myanmar. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. What we focus on is, even if the military are corrupt, but that is their government, that is their own. I was going to say shit, but it's their own choices. Ultimately, it needs to be solved internally. The problem is when it's controlling Washington, then you lose absolutely all control. You have no word to say. And that's what I want to highlight. Every single time, even in, let's say you go to Afghanistan and you see, well, that's the Taliban. Guess what? At least the Taliban is the internal problem. What we are against is that why would all the decisions in Afghanistan should be taken in Washington? And that is the problem. That is the problem. Sovereignty first. After, what? Well, it's not perfect. They have to change. They have to choose their own path. And most of those systems that are not working, do you know why they're not working? Because many of those systems, they were imposed by Western powers, and they were not taking into account that a political system needs to take into account the history, the culture, the customs, and so on and so on. It's like you go into the Middle East. The way they want to have a democracy is by tribes. They have many different tribes, and they get together and they find a solution. That's how they work. So every single country needs to find their own system. But what we are against is interference. That's all.
Absolutely. And this comment encapsulates this idea perfectly. The U.S. cares about democracy so much, and understanding that democracy is a process of self-determination. It is selecting the leaders for other countries. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this when we get to Taiwan, which isn't even a country. And we'll show how we always hear about Taiwan's aspirations for independence, and yet all it's actually doing is building massive dependency on the United States, fashioning itself into a colony or disposable battering ram for the U.S. Now, let's go and talk about the Philippines. I think, Angela, you sent me this Reuters article, how the U.S. courted the Philippines to thwart China. So you have to understand that even if you read this Reuters article, they're going to explain this has nothing to do with building the Philippines up. The Philippines has over 13 million people, and yet it has a smaller GDP than Thailand, which has about 70 million people. It had been a literal U.S. colony until 1946, and the U.S. has exercised, to one degree or another, political capture of the Philippines ever since, which is why for decades it has lagged behind the rest of Southeast Asia, despite having an overabundance of human resources and natural resources. So keep that in mind. This is what the Reuters article says. It says, America has rushed to mend relations with its former colony after ties frayed under former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. It has lavished attention on new leader Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and sent military equipment and vaccines. If you've ever been to the Philippines, these are the, and when they talk about, well, let's not talk about the V word, but these are things that the Philippines needs the least. They don't need military equipment. They don't need big pharma products from the United States. They need infrastructure. They need railways. They need roads. They need ports. They need factories. They need these things that makes a modern nation state thrive. The U.S. is offering none of this, absolutely none of this. It says Washington needs Manila in its camp as tensions with China rise in the Indo-Pacific. Reuters got inside the charm offensive. You could look up the title of this article. Maybe I'll put a list of the references in the video description afterwards. And then it's basically admitting that they're using the Philippines as a battering ram against China. It says the Philippines, Taiwan's neighbor to the south, so because this is all about Taiwan, would be indispensable staging point for the U.S. military to aid Taipei in the event of a Chinese attack. Military analysts say, and if there is a Chinese attack, it will only be because the U.S. provoked it. And we've talked about this, how the U.S. officially recognizes Taiwan as part of China, and yet is staging their own troops there, selling weapons to a separatist administration in Taipei. And it goes on and on, things that if any country did to the United States, it would be considered an act of war. And then it says China's ruling Communist Party views democratically governed Taiwan as an inalienable part of China and refuses to rule out force to bring the island under its control. And this is, again, this is just what Reuters always does. They lie about absolutely everything. And if you go to the U.S. State Department's own website, they're saying it's a democratically governed island. They try to make it out as if it's a country. But if you go to the State Department's official website right here, it says, we do not support Taiwan independence. And if you don't support their independence, it means they're dependent on someone. Who are they dependent on? China. They're part of China. Under international law, it is recognized as part of China. So here's Reuters depicting this as if China's just imagining that Taiwan is part of its sovereign territory. That's what Reuters does. That's what the Western media does. And then it says, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, is a pact signed in 2014 between the U.S. and the Philippines. It permits the U.S. military to access Philippine bases and strategic sites for joint training and to construct facilities such as runways, fuel storage, and troop housing. Troop housing for whose troops? The agreement was expanded in 2023 to allow the United States access to 9 locations, up from 5 previously. So we've talked about this previously, about the U.S. getting access to more Philippine bases and expanding the infrastructure, the military infrastructure there. And that says Reuters has been detailing the race between China and the United States to bulk up on advanced technologies that could determine who secures military and economic supremacy this century, and more specifically, who will have supremacy over Asia. China, the largest country in Asia, or the United States on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, nowhere near Asia. It seems obvious what's going on here. And they talk about aerial and sea drones, AI-controlled weapons, and cutting-edge surveillance are fast reshaping warfare with implications for the global balance of power. For the United States, cementing alliances in the Asia-Pacific region is likewise crucial to keeping China in check. The U.S. embrace of Marcos is key to that project. So again, it has nothing to do with the U.S. wanting to assist the Philippines. They are openly admitting this is about using the Philippines against China because the U.S. desires to control, contain, divide, and destroy China. That is what all of this is all about. And then when you point this out, there's this Angela pointed this out also. Press One is some fake fact-checking media organization in the Philippines, very nebulous about who actually funds them. And they're talking about pro-China narrative shared across various pro-China disinformation websites. And this is about an article that I wrote, and all I pointed out, and literally all I did was cite articles like this from Reuters about the U.S. gaining access to these bases. And this is another fact check where they are claiming that the U.S. is not building new military bases in the Philippines. And then when you actually read the details, they're playing semantics. The U.S. is building facilities in these bases. They're getting access to them, but they're not building brand new bases. But for the U.S., they are new bases. So they're playing a word game. Why are they doing that? The point I'm making here is they know what the U.S. is doing to the Philippines. They know how dangerous it is. They know if they explain it to the people in the Philippines, they would oppose this because it is turning the Philippines into another Ukraine. And if people understood that, they would oppose it. And that is the last thing they want. They want this to keep building momentum until the Philippines is in the process of being burned to the ground, just like Ukraine. Angela, have any other thoughts about this? I think they also mentioned you in this article, didn't they?
Yes. Well, I think because you are, I think they're trying to expose you because they're feeling extremely uncomfortable. But I want to highlight one thing. I mean, we need to repeat that most of the research that we do, you and I, we are pretty much all the time using Western sources because
Yes.
we don't want to be accused to just to be on the other side, and because they're so transparent. Actually, luckily for us, they're extremely transparent. When we look at the plans, those plans that are through the think tank's papers, it says clearly what are their plans, who are funding them. So it is easy for us to do that. So so they have a hard time to debunk us. So it's just inconvenient truth there. What else when it comes to the Philippines? I think it would be interesting to look at the trades of the Philippines. Where does the Philippines export and how dependent actually the Philippines are? I just checked just before the show. I checked if you can go back to 96. Actually, you can check. We can compare. Would be interesting that. So if you go back to 96, we can see the shifts. Now the 96. If you click, can you click there?
Okay.
96.
Yes.
So here,
huge difference. Huge
United
difference.
States, they were doing 32.94%, and now we can see today how much is the shift. China was irrelevant, so China we need to add 20 plus 11% because a lot of trades are going through Hong Kong. The single reason is because of it's a tax haven, so they're not going directly through China, but they actually leave some profit in Hong Kong. So you just add up those two positions, we are at 32%. If you look at the 14%, actually I checked the 14% of United States. You know what it is? It's IT services. It's call centers. I mean, that's what they do. So they could be completely dropped. When you are giving those service as export, they can ditch you overnight. It's not very valuable. When you are trading commodities, you trading finished product, that's much more difficult to shift suppliers. So here you have this dependency of the Philippines. You have 32% of your trade. It's with China. You're shooting yourself into the foot. And the interesting part is that the US wants to have a presence in the region. The reason they claim it's because of freedom of navigation. But freedom of navigation, it is important for China and the Philippines, not so much for the US. You see, I mean, that's so important for the countries in the region.
And this is CSIS, is a U.S. government arms industry funded think tank, and even they admit that China, by far, it is their traffic, their trade going through these waters the U.S. supposedly wants to protect. And when the U.S. says protect, they actually mean threaten. The U.S. is there to threaten and, if possible, cut off Chinese trade in their own waters, off their own coasts. That is what the U.S. is actually doing. That is what the Philippines is a party to. And that's what I was trying to point out in my article. Just like Ukraine before 2014, their economy was semi-integrated with the Russian Federation. They did a huge amount of business with the Russian Federation. They share a border. They had been part of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire throughout history. They speak almost a common language. Half the population speaks Russian. And from 2014 onward, the U.S. installed a client regime that irrationally cut themselves off from Russia and completely destroyed Ukraine's economy. It's just been a downward spiral ever since. And that is what the US is trying to do to the Philippines. It's what they're trying to do to countries all across Asia. Here in Thailand, they had candidates that openly said they were going to cancel infrastructure projects with China and pivot back to the US and Europe and Japan, who don't have anything of equal value to offer Thailand. And the same goes for the Philippines, maybe more so. And as you point out, Angela, most of the economic activity that the US conducts with these countries, it's exploitative. It does not give them the infrastructure they need to be a thriving modern nation state. So that is a very good point that you bring up. Let's see if we have anything else on. No, I think that's it for the Philippines. Yes, go ahead, Angela.
Do you have any idea? I mean, maybe we can just drop a few ideas on what would be the triggers actually for direct confrontations, triggers that would be within the countries, with the countries in the region or related to Taiwan. So what would be if you were to make a list of what could be the triggers, or maybe false flag operation, or what do you think? Because China, it's not in China's interest just to take back Taiwan. So they need a trigger. And what will be what is your view? What are the conditions for China to go into a hot war with the US there in the region?
It's a good question. And like you said, China does not want a war. They know time is on their side. And if they just let time run out on the clock, they will win without having to fire a shot, essentially. And you see the U.S. desperately trying to provoke conflict with China. The U.S. Semi-secretly placing U.S. troops in Taiwan. The U.S. doing these joint patrols. And I think now Australia, maybe even Canada, which makes no sense at all, are doing joint patrols with the Philippines. And they're desperately pushing the Philippines out there to become increasingly confrontational with China. Again, despite the fact that it does not serve their interests at all whatsoever. Whatever it's not even an island. It's a reef or something, and they're fighting over this. And does fighting over that somehow give you something worth more than your trade and your cooperation and prosperity that you're enjoying with China? Does it? And by the way, I think this is also important to point out. This hit piece on Angelo and myself, they referred to the South China Sea, which is what everyone refers to it. Any map will say South China Sea, but they refer to it as West Philippine Sea. And this sounds very familiar to these U.S. government-funded fanatics like the people in Xinjiang calling it East Turkestan, or all of these groups trying to rename things on the map because they're separatists or they're provocateurs, and they're trying to do things that are even contravening international law and conventions. So I just thought I would point that out. Now, regarding your question, Angela, if you look at what the U.S. is doing, they're putting their bases in Japan, in South Korea, now increasingly in the Philippines. They're developing missile systems. I have an article and a video coming out on this. These new missile systems the U.S. is developing, and they're going to obviously deploy them immediately to Asia Pacific. That is why they're designing these, to shoot them at China, to point them at China and eventually shoot them at China. And what they're doing is they're creating a situation in Asia that makes it almost impossible for China to react in self-defense, because they know they're basically using Japan, the Philippines, South Korea as nation-sized human shields. That's what they're doing. And Angela, you've seen the policy papers put out by U.S. think tanks talking about how it will be great if China shoots missiles at Okinawa or mainland Japan. It would be really great if they did that, because then Japan and also South Korea, they would be compelled to then join us in this war that we really don't want to fight by ourselves. We really would like to have some proxies go into the meat grinder ahead of us. So this is the plan. And so that's why I think China is so reluctant to be provoked, despite the U.S.'s best efforts. Obviously, infringement on Taiwan, China's sovereignty over Taiwan, that could be a trigger. It depends on I think the U.S. is just going to keep doing things up the escalation ladder until they get a reaction, and they'll continue compelling the Philippines to do this as well. And I just hope China is patient and has a plan, and they realize that the Philippines will be hurting themselves more than they'll be hurting China in all of this. And I think they could. I think they can manage to do that. And I think we should actually talk about Taiwan in more detail, and then we could talk about some of the possible triggers, because when you look at what they're doing ahead of the elections, Angela, do you remember when the elections are coming up soon? Do you know exactly when? Sometime next year, early next year?
January, I think it's January to this coming January, mid-January. So that's the first, I think it's probably 2 tours. So you need to have the absolute majority. If you don't have the absolute majority, there's a second round, right? So you have 3 parties. You have the Kuomintang, KMT, which is the Nationalist Party, the party, I mean, the original mainland party that went over in 1949 to Taiwan. Then you have the DPP, which is a proxy, US proxy, where you have the candidates were all pre-selected by the US. So you had Tsai Ing-wen at the beginning. You had actually at the very beginning, when they took power was with Chiang Kai-shek, and then you have Tsai Ing-wen, and then you have another protege now that is actually running for this election. Which, by the way, there is a poll actually that came out today that says that DPP is going down, so it's not the favorite. And then you have the TPP. TPP, it's a new party. They were actually, TPP was supposed to have a joint ticket between TPP and Kuomintang, but at the last minute they drop out of the race. And there was Mr. Gou, who's the CEO of Foxconn. He was, sorry, he's a pro-China, pro-reunification. He just dropped out of the elections. But those are, I think what would be interesting is that the shift of voices. So people that actually were in favor of Gou, the CEO of Foxconn, would probably vote for Kuomintang. And you, at this stage, I checked the polls, there's 20% of undecided voters. But we need to be extremely careful, because in the history of the election in Taiwan, we had a few events where they actually, they were kind of rigged elections. 2004, Chiang Kai-shek, just the day before the election, he was shot, but it was a fake shooting. He had scratches. And what he got, he won. He was not the favorite, but he won because of the compassionate vote. And so the Kuomintang was outraged. And what they did was to do, to check what did really happen. And they could not check on his body, what the scratches he had. And the people, the doctors that went to check him, they came from the US, and it was like very opaque. So we didn't know exactly what happened. And then we had in 2014-15, we had the Sunflower Revolution. So there was, an attempt of color revolution. And because of that movement that was instigated by the US, there was a shift of votes in favor of the DPP. And we had again, in 2020, they won because of the riots in Hong Kong, which were actually supported and funded both by the US and Taiwan. So you see, they managed to actually kind of rig the election, to influence the elections very unfairly 3 times. That's the 3 times that the DPP won. So what I'm afraid of is that probably you might have again another case where they're going to try to rig the elections.
Yeah, I was just going to say that no matter what people would try to logically vote for, the US is going to be in there interfering. You have to remember there's the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, which is just an NED franchise there on the island of Taiwan. They work openly together with the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. NED personnel go to Taiwan and vice versa. And I just wanted to talk about, again, Angelo, you were the one who pointed this out. And I think you did a very good job explaining the background of what these elections will be unfolding within. And this is from Al Jazeera. William Lai names Taiwan's former U.S. envoy as election running mate. And there's no U.S. envoy because Taiwan is not a country. So it's a fake envoy who had U.S. citizenship, who had lived in the United States and is half American. And this is who they're going to name. And again, we keep hearing about Taiwan. It wants to be independent. It's democratic. And in reality, these are transparent U.S. puppets. And in this article, and then there's also this one in the New York Times, I'm going to read a little bit from these articles. They basically admit that she spends most of her time in Washington working with the U.S. government against China. That's what she does. So how about maybe we go to the New York Times article, and they talk about the U.S. does not officially recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Miss, how do you pronounce her name? Is it Xiao?
Xiao. You know, the way actually in Taiwan they write what they call the pinyin. You know, it's a bit different from China. So they have their own, but it's probably Xiao. You know, just the tone, the pronunciation might be different, but it's Xiao.
Okay. So Miss Xiao does not work under the graceful title of ambassador. Instead, she is the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative. Instead of an embassy, her office is known as the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office. And this is what the U.S. does. They officially recognize international law, China's sovereignty over Taiwan, but everything else that they do, they are violating it blatantly. And so they have all of these de facto organizations and positions where they are interacting with Taiwan as if it was a country, even though it is not. And they talk about, for years, U.S. officials prohibited her predecessors from visiting the White House and the State Department. Such guidelines have relaxed over time, and she now pays regular, if discreet, visits to the West Wing and Foggy Bottom. She is an undisguised regular on Capitol Hill, as when she sat next to Kevin McCarthy, then the House Republican leader, last summer for a live-streamed discussion by his caucus's China Task Force. She really does have the confidence of people here in Washington, said Bonnie Glacier, a Chinese expert with the German Marshall Fund, who has also known Miss Xiao for many years. And then it says, it helps, Miss Xiao said, that appreciation in Washington has grown for Taiwan as a democracy, as a force for good, and as a true partner of the United States. At the same time, she said the threat from the Chinese government that talks of absorbing Taiwan weighs heavily. But under international law, China doesn't need to absorb Taiwan because it is recognized as part of China. And what she is saying to the New York Times in this interview or article about her is that Taiwan is it's not a partner of Washington, it is a proxy, is an extension of Washington's foreign policy toward China. So all of this talk about an independent, democratically administrated Taiwan is nonsense. There is no democracy because there is, as you point out many times, Angela, there is no sovereignty. Everything about Taiwan's future is being decided by Washington, in Washington, for Washington's interests, not the people actually living on the island of Taiwan. And I just want to point out, Taiwan's trade with the rest of China is almost 50%. It's close to half of their exports go to the rest of China. And then in terms of imports, again, and China and most of the rest of China, and these are important inputs for their semiconductor and electrical component industry. So if they decide to pursue this independence, this illusion of independence, this subordination, this open subordination to Washington, and China decides to cut off the local economy in Taiwan, it'll disappear. Nobody can compensate for the rest of China's role in keeping Taiwan's economy afloat. Angela, is there any observations you want to make about this aspect? How obvious it is that Taiwan pursuing independence is going to destroy Taiwan, its economy, if not the island physically. How could people on Taiwan be pursuing their best interests by pursuing independence, which is not even real independence?
Well, sadly, when you look at the case of Taiwan, it looks so similar to what happened in Ukraine, Well, keep in mind that in Ukraine, even someone like Zelensky, he ran on a platform of making peace with Russia. So he had 73% of votes for him. And ultimately, not only was a puppet working against his own country, but ultimately he didn't keep on his promise. The first thing he did was actually to go against his promise and antagonize Russia. So here we have very similar case. Sometimes it's just what we call soft coup. In Ukraine, it was violent, but they didn't need to have half the population to go in the street. Ultimately, it was a radical minority, a few thousand thugs in Maidan Square that took over. They were extremely violent. They were willing to kill. You had snipers there, and that's how they took power. What worries me is when you look at Taiwan's sovereignty and all the actors in this democracy, what we call the civil society, is already extremely hijacked. When you look at the media, most of the media, you put the ranking of the largest media in Taiwan, you don't have pro-reunification media. They were kicked out, and because they found a way to kick them out. So you have Epoch Times, which is funded by the US, which belongs to Falun Gong. You have the Apple Daily, which was actually working for the US in Hong Kong, which they kicked out Apple Daily, but it's one of the largest media in Taiwan. So you list all those media, the information space. Additional to that, you have the big tech, US big tech that are there. When you have Facebook, Instagram, all those platforms, you can control Taiwan's democracy. And then additional to that, they've been planting the seeds early on. They changed the history books. They've been brainwashing the kids, even the culture. It's when you look at even Taiwan, they wanted to be so progressive that they are probably the most progressive country in the region. Taiwan in Asia, I think it's the first country that adopted the gay marriage. Not that I'm against it, but you see those are patterns. It's the same as Ukraine. Ukraine wants to be even more progressive than the US.
I just want to point out that they didn't do that because they actually care about equal rights. They're just doing it because it's prescribed by the US, which is dictating their foreign and domestic policy. And it is, just like you say, Angela, it's just for them to fit in with the West and adopt these issues. And they're trying to do the same thing here in Thailand. Thailand is a very tolerant society. You don't have these same issues. And yet you see the US artificially just plopping it in the middle of Thai society. And Thai people are like, what is this? We didn't even have a problem. And yet somehow they're making it a problem. So I think that's a very good point to elaborate on. Please continue, Angelo.
Well, just a hijack democracy, and so they change also the history books. So you have this new generation that are brainwashed by Hollywood, Netflix, and also you have the history books. When Chen Shui-bian came into power, I think it was 2004, they changed the history books. So when you read the history books in Taiwan, for the kids, they learn that the history in Taiwan started in 1949. They don't take into account the 2,000 years of history, this common history that Taiwan has with China. So you see, it's a slow process, and this is why now you have this clash, this difference of voting. You have the kids voting, the young that are voting more for the DPP, the Progressive Party, and the older generation that are closer to, they understand, they've learned a different history, and they're more pragmatic. You see that they are more for the Kuomintang, which is more rational, more pro-reunification. Again, I'm not saying that they are completely different. I'm not expecting, let's say, if the Kuomintang is to be elected, is to win, I'm not seeing a complete radical shift. I think they'll balance. They have a more balanced approach, more pragmatic, but they won't go into total reunification. They're not into that position that they had in 2015. In 2015, there was a free trade agreement between Taiwan and mainland China, and that was almost a de facto step to reunification. Imagine they even had a plan to do a bridge between mainland to a small island which is extremely close to China. I think it's Jinmen Island, and that belongs to Taiwan. So you see, there was a symbol of this bridge between Taiwan and the mainland. And then what happened? Sunflower Revolution. That's how everything fell apart. And since then, it's been like completely a disaster. But again, just when you look at the polls right now, it looks like DPP is not doing well. So hopefully, let's see. Hopefully, the Kuomintang gets back into power, and they'll be probably more pragmatic.
Yes, and I want to point out a couple of things that you were talking about. And look, I understand the appeal of people wanting to believe that ordinary people have agency and they make their minds up based on rational decisions. We should respect their vote. But in reality, no. If you're being poisoned and misled from the moment you're born, all throughout your education, every time you turn on the media is showing you only one side. The vast majority of people raised in an environment like that are not going to understand what is really going on, and they're not going to be able to make a genuinely informed decision. In that case, democracy, self-determination is impossible. You're being manipulated, and you don't have the means to understand. Now, of course, there are exceptions, but the rule is the majority are not going to be able to see through it and understand it. And that is why I say, when you look at Taiwan and you see more and more people leaning toward independence, but then you look at this, and you see how dependent Taiwan's economy is on the rest of China. What a disaster, a Ukraine-style disaster that would be for everyone there. You can see that they're making irrational decisions, running contra to their own best interests. And I'm pointing this out. Hong Kong, China, they don't have one for Taiwan. I don't think that they do, because they have the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. It's like a much larger NED intervention on the island. But this is just Hong Kong. And if you look at the nature of these programs, they're meddling in things that if China or Russia were doing this in the US, it would be headline news. It would create a row, possibly put us on the edge of war between the US and whoever was trying to do this. So we saw what happened even when there was imaginary Russian or Chinese interference. Imagine if either one did it on the scale the NED does. And if you go to their website, where we work, and you look at some of these, Hong Kong, they've been purged after the national security law went into effect. But if you go to some of these countries, I mean, it's just a list a mile long, just like 80, 90 programs and multiple organizations under each one. And this is the political capture by the US of a sovereign nation. This is how they begin manipulating people. They demand that there be democracy because they know they can influence people and how they vote. No matter how many elections they have in, say, the Philippines or in Myanmar, they know they can get an outcome that favors and advances US interests. It is not democracy. It's the smokescreen of democracy, behind which is the US political capture, modern day imperialism. There was one other point I wanted to make about Taiwan, especially something that you were talking about. Go ahead, Angelo. Maybe I'll come back.
Just what you mentioned, NED. So NED is the rebranding name of CIA, and but NED is actually, that's the tip of the iceberg. I'm just going to give just one example for viewers. There's an entity called USAGM. This is the propaganda arm of the US, and you can see who they fund. But you can go to a USAGM as an independent journalist, and you say, guess what? What do you want me to write for you? And they are going to tell you, if you cover China, well, why don't you do a paper on the Belt and Road Initiative? Negative, of course, negative coverage, and they pay well. They pay extremely well. Guess what? You know the budget, yearly budget, only for USAGM, it's $1 billion. Inside USAGM, you have Radio Free Asia. Actually, the money I mentioned just before, Epoch Times. Epoch Times is funded by the Falun Gong sects. And who's funding the Falun Gong sects? They get money from USAGM. And that's how it works. So this is only the propaganda arm. Then you have NED, is one part. Then you have lots of different NGOs. You have Open Society of George Soros. You have USAID. What they do is actually the way they approach each country is different. And I find out that when it comes like to very, very poor countries, they like to use USAID, humanitarian aid, and that's entry door. But ultimately, the money, if you look at the proportion, there's probably more than half of what they give through USAID. It's related to country meddling, buying influence, and controlling the country's sovereignty.
Yes, absolutely. And I just had the South China Morning Post article on there about the U.S. allocating money, millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to fund anti-China media. That's what they're doing. And then that anti-China media, I can almost guarantee you, results in organizations like this who then attack people who are just pointing out what is really going on. And, it's about trying to prevent the next Ukraine. We can see the complete destruction of Ukraine unfolding daily now. We can see the inability for people in Ukraine to lead normal lives well into the future. I don't want to see that happen anywhere else, not the island of Taiwan, not the country of the Philippines, not anywhere. I'm tired of watching Myanmar slow burn to the ground as well. Just think about all the horrors we've seen in Ukraine. That is already happening on a smaller scale, but still happening nonetheless in Myanmar every single day. We used to cover it, and we even used to point out NED-funded media outlets admitting that the so-called rebels, the freedom fighters, were killing teachers just because they weren't going along with their boycott and their anti-government activities. So this is real. What the U.S. is doing is real. People that accuse me or Angelo of blaming everything on the U.S., I mean, again, just go to the NED's website where they work and see for yourself. That is a global map right there. They have a presence on every continent except Antarctica, and they are meddling in virtually every country on Earth. So they actually are behind a lot of what we're seeing. And the point of talking about this is because we see what's going on in Ukraine. We see the Middle East teetering on the edge of wider conflict. And ultimately, though, the U.S. is obsessed with stopping China from surpassing the U.S. and the collective West. And that's what they're going to be focused on. Here's another.
I have another example of Brian, NED. There's especially now because there's going to be the next election in Venezuela. The opposition candidate, which is backed by the U.S., she was funded. Her name is Machado, and she had a media called Sumate. Sumate was funded by NED. So you have literally a candidate that is funded by CIA. And this is why, it's very inconvenient for them. This is why the Philippines, this fact-checking media is coming after us, because it's so inconvenient. It's just out there. We're not inventing anything. We just go, well, guess what? You go to ned.org, and this lady, opposition, she's been funded by the CIA. Why would you, you can have the worst government on earth, but don't vote for someone who's funded by the CIA, right?
Yeah, it's obviously, but good luck explaining that to some of these people. And again, it's not their fault, especially these young people. They understand young people are rebellious by nature. They understand that, and they prey on that. And they get these kids to adopt these contrarian positions, and they use them as cannon fodder in these protests out in the street. And we used to do live streams of the protests here in Thailand. And so it is one thing that the U.S. is extremely good at is, number one, just killing people with their endless wars all around the globe. It's also manipulating and politically capturing states. Their ability to infiltrate information in political space and take over it is much more effective than their ability militarily to do this, I would even say. And it's extremely dangerous, and people don't even think about it. People that you talk to who are aware the U.S. is meddling, they don't look at it as a type of invasion and conquest. The information space and the political space isn't even treated as a domain of sovereignty when it actually should, and national security policy should reflect that. But unfortunately now, not yet, at least in Russia and China. Hopefully people learn from that and start following suit. I just wanted to point out this comment: take away the chips from Taiwan and their importance fades. And that is such a good point, isn't it, Angelo? And what is the US actually doing to Taiwan? They are actually trying to take the chips away so that they have no hesitation to just feed it into the wood chipper. And they are literally making Taiwanese chip companies build facilities in the US, transfer personnel, transfer their intellectual property to the United States, so that there's nothing left on Taiwan that is worth anything, so that they don't feel any guilt or any repercussions of burning it to the ground. And they're in their policy papers, they even talk about this. So Angelo, my worry is the United States obviously doesn't care about Taiwan. They know time favors China. What they want to do is not protect China. Obviously, they don't care about that, or even create an independent Taiwan. They know China's going to get it back. They want to make the price as high as possible for that to happen, which means doing everything in their power to kill everybody and destroy everything and make it as painful as possible for China as they do so. That is what they're doing. That's what we see them doing in Europe with Ukraine, and also the EU just destroying their economy. We can't have it. Nobody will. I believe that the whole Israeli-Gaza conflict is all about doing the same in the Middle East. And this is what they have themselves articulated in their policy papers in regards to Taiwan. What do you think? We're past 1 hour. Maybe just your final thoughts on especially Taiwan and this whole process of unipolarism shifting to multipolarism, and the U.S. Their last ditch effort to reverse it.
Well, Europe is a good example. We see but they were very clear too. They knew that there was this cooperation which was very mutually beneficial. You had Europe needed for its heavy industry, especially Germany. They needed cheap energy, and they destroyed completely this relationship because that was extremely dangerous for the US. There's this huge bloc, Eurasia. Eurasia is going to be 70% of the world economy, probably. So it's massive, and so you have this whole bloc. If it cooperates together, if it's stable, if it prospers, would make the US irrelevant. And we see the shift. The shift is all there. But I think we need to look at what is happening. I think look at the big picture. This shift is happening. Every single day that passes, we are going to experience the shift. The shift is becoming more real. And the more closer we are to that, the more we are going to have the US, which is extremely weak, which will not be able to sustain different front, which will not be able, especially now, just think about it, the interest of the debt. They raise the interest rates. The interest of the debt of the US amounts to the same level of its defense spending, meaning that it's not sustainable. You cannot, they're not able to even repay their interest rate, and the debt is at over 30 trillions. So they're just desperate, and they need to do something now because they're losing the edge. The US dollar is the key. Once you lose that, the relevance of the US dollar, you lose the ability to print endless money. And that's the key. And that shift is happening. Even the US allies are ditching the US dollar. And that tells you that's a reality. And we need to look at, especially pay close attention to BRICS. There's another, just recently, did you know that Brazil announced it's going to join OPEC Plus? Imagine that power, and who's in OPEC Plus? It's all mainly countries from the global south. So now you have OPEC Plus, which is much stronger. They have the ability, they are starting to trade in non-US dollar currencies, in their own currencies. And now you have BRICS, and BRICS is expanding. And that's the shift. It's happening. It's just time. Time is in favor. Every single day that there's no war, especially with China, we are getting closer to a new reality, which is multipolar world. And they need to accept that's a reality. You need to accept. 15% of the world cannot rule over the 85%. And in this case, it's more like the 4%. The US is 4% ruling over the 96%.
And then out of that, the percentage of people in the United States that are actually driving this and benefiting from it is like less than 1%. So it's important to understand that. Those are all really great points, Angelo. And this is exactly why we read these policy papers over the years and their plans, what they think is going to happen between some sort of armed conflict between the United States and China, say over the status of Taiwan. And they talk about things like, we don't have to do a blockade because no one's going to insure any ship sending goods to and from China. That it'll be a de facto blockade. But we see now that there are many companies around the world now insuring ships. It is not a monopoly the West holds anymore. And actually, the tighter the U.S. tries to grip onto global hegemony, the more it slips between their fingers. We watch them try to strangle Russia, and Russia, China, BRICS, many countries, Iran especially, they've all been developing alternatives to U.S.-dominated financial systems, trade, insurance, all of these things that the U.S. is, and Europe has dominated for decades. They've been making alternatives. When the U.S. tried to strangle Russia over Ukraine, they just accelerated the process. And you're talking about the expansion of BRICS. I feel like that is accelerating because of the U.S. proxy war on Russia in Ukraine. Now, imagine if they try to do the same thing to China. I think it's going to be a disaster for them. And it's not going to work out the way they imagine. And I think when I talk about the missile programs in the near future, I think it'll be very clear that the U.S. is going to have the same or actually worse problems fighting China than they have in their proxy war against Russia, especially in terms of technology and military industrial output. Angela, you have any closing thoughts? Any last things you want to say? I think.
Yeah, I think I think what China and Russia are doing is just countermeasure. Chinese, they say that's in Chinese, 上有建设，下有对策. It means if there are measures, you can have countermeasure. And that's what they've been doing all along. You mentioned just before, that is extremely important. I was thinking just before the show, just industrial capacity. Imagine Russia has more capacity than the EU and the US combined when it comes to military industrial outputs. Just imagine China. I have seen with my own eyes the efficiency just to make things happen. It is like Russia multiplied by 10. It's going to be much, much faster. I would say the only way you could actually hurt China is if you manage to control the energy supply. But what China has been doing is actually over the years is to secure this energy supply. In the Middle East, it has very strong partnership. You can see actually, especially with the Saudi Arabia and especially with Russia. If you cannot manage to hurt China there, it's impossible. You can't beat China. On the worst case scenario, you might actually contain it. It's going to delay that shift, but I don't see. It's a lose-lose approach what the U.S. is doing.
Absolutely, and as I always say, and this is what I'll close on. China is a bigger country than the United States. It has almost 5 times the population, as you mentioned, Angelo. A much larger industrial base, also a military industrial base. They have weapon systems that the U.S. doesn't even have. I always hear China just copies everything because it's impossible for a non-white nation to be innovative. And yet China has weapon systems that are better than anything the U.S. has. Certain systems the U.S. doesn't even have. So who did they copy that from? And so between that, their economy, their growing military, just the size of their population, We've talked about their education system, the fact that they graduate millions more in terms of engineering, mathematics, science, design, everything, useful skills that are used to shape the economy. It doesn't even make sense for the United States to worry about being surpassed by China. It's a bigger country, bigger economy, bigger military. It will have more power. It's like Portugal having a meltdown because the United States has a larger economy than they do. It doesn't even make sense. It's completely irrational. Now imagine if Portugal had this zero-sum foreign policy where they were trying to reverse that. It would be completely insane. But because the United States has been number one for so long, people just take it for granted, and they're not looking at the fundamentals, going back to zero and building a thesis to see if it makes any sense anymore. It doesn't make any sense. There will be catastrophic consequences. The longer the U.S. clings to this delusion, they're going to ultimately do as much damage to themselves as they do to anyone else. So what needs to happen is the U.S. needs to find a constructive role to play among all other nations rather than insisting to impose itself on all other nations. I say that over and over again, but it's absolutely true. So I want to thank you, Angelo, for taking out your time on Friday evening. I want to thank everyone who tuned in. I'm humbled that you would pick your Friday night to join with us. Thank you so much. Again, in the video description will be all the places you can find and follow Angelo's work, as well as other places you can find the new atlas. And until next time, bye for now.